Hello, listeners, from Roy Demarev in Sam, speaking to you again on a hot summer's day. When you watch the antics of monkeys in the zoo, in their cage, you observe they jump around a lot to no apparent purpose. They achieve nothing. It is much the same with watching the Trump presidency. He charges around a lot, or he mouths off a lot, and achieves nothing. So far, we've had these failures, and the latest is, of course, the failure of trying to repeal and replace Obamacare, where he has been defeated by his own party. And a jolly good thing, too, because the idea of leaving 20 million American citizens without health coverage is not appealing to me or to anybody else, except, of course, to Donald Trump himself. He is mightily preoccupied with the Russian story. It may all be a red herring, but the preoccupation of his own self, plus his family members, is really quite disturbing, when it might be thought he should better be getting on with learning how to be a president, even if he hasn't got much idea so far. There is now a lot of doubt about the next major move, which is to tax less, but nevertheless increase spending. The fact that that is self-contradictory seems not to have dawned upon him. He thinks that the economy will expand enough to absorb this gap between the revenues of the government and the expenditures of the government. Of course, the expansion isn't there anyway, and that is, again, one of the things he is unable to deliver. But we've always said that. In fairness, I'm not coming to you today and saying, look, it doesn't look as though, after all, Donald Trump can deliver the 3% growth he's promised. It's never been possible, but it hasn't yet dawned on him that it is impossible. Now, it's very noticeable, to me at least, that Janet Yellen, who is the current chair of the Fed, has expressed doubts on the 3% promised growth. It is not being achieved, and it can't be achieved. The reason it can't be achieved has been spelt out on this program before, is to do basically with the aging population and the declining workforce, even though the retirement force, if you like, is getting greater. There are good things. I think it's wonderful that you see older men in particular, but also older ladies, working in places like Home Depot, being full of enthusiasm and still with enough energy left. That is good news for those of us who have passed the official retirement age and intend to keep working. I've seen the same thing in Switzerland. This very week, my wife and I went up the Teleferique at Stans. First, there's a very ancient funicular railway which trundles up a rather gentle slope to the lower end of a rather new, I think it's 2012, Teleferique, which takes you to the top of the mountain. The view up there is absolutely spectacular, and from the very top, which is a 10-minute further walk on from the Teleferique, you can count the number of lakes you see, and apparently there are 10 of them. We only got to 8, but there are apparently 10 lakes visible, and you've got this marvellous view on Mount Titlis. However, the point of my statement about the ride up the mountain is that all the staff were elderly gentlemen, and I thought it was really rather nice. They were still full of energy. They conversed with you. They made nice announcements. I thought, this is the way to go when you get past official retirement age. Keep at it. And all that evidence is coming forth, apparently. It was on the BBC this morning, that the brain that is kept active avoids you falling into Alzheimer's, which is otherwise a huge problem. Lots of things have been coming out on from research recently and published on BBC and like sources like The Economist. It is that we are, of course, living longer. It may be that in the United Kingdom there's a levelling off now, and that we will not extend our lives a much more, at least in the foreseeable future. There's been a levelling off. But of course, all these decisions about delaying the age of retirement now being pushed to 68 for people in their early or mid-40s is unnecessary and even justified in the sense of moral justification as a move to balance the pension budgets and the rate at which people working have to pay for the pensions of people who've already retired. Let me come back to my statement a few minutes ago that Janet Yellen doubts the 3% objective of growth that Trump has set himself as an objective and even made a promise of it. The three candidates to replace her, which won't be for a little while yet, have all said, oh yes, the 3% is perfectly achievable. We can agree with that. Now, whether or not they are lying through their teeth or whether they are simply fooling themselves can be debated. But I would admit this straight away, that anybody who said, well, they agree with Yellen, it does look a little bit difficult for us to achieve 3% now that we have this aging population. Anybody who said that would not be welcomed by Donald Trump as the chairperson of the Fed. Whether one of the three candidates will actually change his mind when he faces reality remains to be seen. So far, what we've seen with Donald Trump is that facing reality doesn't change anything. He just continues in his dream world. I read an interesting article in the Financial Times just before making this broadcast. It is that the Republican Party spent about the last 7 years opposing everything the President Obama that was, came up with. So they got used to blocking and were not at all used or experienced in putting together the bills that might make progress in the American economy. So they no longer know how to compromise, to pull together as a team and things like that. And that is reflected perfectly in the failure to replace Obamacare. Now, good thing too, as I keep saying, because it would have been disaster to replace it, putting 20 million people out of health insurance. But that's typical of this divided party and is likely to continue as they enter the discussions on tax cuts. They just don't have the experience or the nous, we'd say in Northern English. They don't have the nous to say, well, we can't achieve everything we want. So let's compromise, let's pull together and find a solution. I'm changing subjects now, but you will remember talks in the past about securitization from me, or you've read about securitization. It's a process whereby assets which are backed by some sort of physical something, a house, but it could also be a student loan or a car. These loans, which are illiquid, you can't, if you own them, can't just turn them back into cash, have been the subject of a process called securitization. They are put together into a massive pile of debt, and that debt is then divided up into units which can be bought and sold, and therefore the original owner of the debt has cash, and something has become very liquid which was illiquid. In the days of the subprime process, the cutting up into units was not just a vertical cut, but had two horizontal cuts as well, and it was all based on the fact that houses would never fall in value, but they did, and so the units became worthless as the interest and the capital repayments from the original mortgages failed to appear. Now, a big problem with the subprime process was that borrowers could certify their own income. In fact, the expression liar's mortgage came about. People could say they were earning something and nothing was done to check it. It's absolutely amazing, that, to me. Absolutely amazing. You'd never get away with that sort of thing in Switzerland. You have to prove everything here. Apparently, it became illegal to do such things already in the United Kingdom from 2010 onwards. That was actually after the subprime process, so it was a bit like closing the stable door after the horse had bolted. Still, the United Kingdom has at least learnt the lesson. I don't think the United States has, but Europe has now learned the lesson. Europe in the sense of the continent and the euro area. They have just passed a new rule that says you can't put into a securitized package mortgages or anything else like that sort of loan without the mortgage having been properly checked out, both for the value of the actual asset behind the mortgage and also the ability of the borrower to pay it back. We could all, in a way, smirk in Switzerland because that sort of thing just doesn't happen here, but apparently it has been happening on the continent, and now Brussels has declared that it will no longer happen. But that in turn creates problems because there are many such packaged mortgages around which have not met the new law and therefore are becoming suspect. There may or may not be real problems on that, or it might just be scaremongering. But it is at least a good thing to see that the UK, Europe and Switzerland have now got the good sense to make sure that if you lend someone some money, he has the means to pay it back and the assets behind the loan. When I get to the end of my weekly broadcast, I would like be able to say what you should be doing with your money. It's very, very difficult. The stock market is continuing to climb, but it's climbing for all the wrong reasons. It's climbing because of make-believe economics from Trump, and it's climbing, and this is perhaps even more important, because bonds, fixed interest returns, are so low now that it's just hopeless. You get a fraction of a percent, certainly in Swiss francs. If you go into euros, it's also a fraction of a percent. If you go into the US dollars, well, there are some which can give you 2% or 2.5% even. But that's in dollars, and it's not always obvious to me that in Europe we should be investing in dollars. I did mention to you a couple of weeks ago, and I hope some of you have taken it up, that a certain cooperative bank, a big one, is now allowing its members, its customers, to expand their holding of the shares or units in the co-op bank. It's not the co-op bank, it's a cooperative bank, and they pay 2% in Swiss francs. You can't beat that, so go for it. If you're not already a customer of them, go for it. You'll find them in the middle of Versoix. Apart from that, I think a Swiss franc-based portfolio is the most solid, and you would have in it probably ETFs or maybe direct shares in major Swiss companies, and some Swiss bonds, perhaps not the national bonds because they do have a negative interest rate, but some good corporate bonds in Swiss francs. That's all I have to say. I just hope that things turn round more than they have, so that we can actually safely reinvest in the stock market and confidently buy bonds in the hope that they give decent returns. But in the meantime, we're in a very dangerous country for stocks. They are highly valued, and there's really only one way to go down in the medium term, never mind the long term, so that they reach a more sensible valuation and can give a return which you can compare with the return on bonds and choose your mixture of bonds and stocks accordingly. All this is kind of old-fashioned, but everything's fallen apart, so that what we normally would teach and advise doesn't work anymore. We'll just have to keep hoping that Europe at least turns round and that the UK comes out of the European Union not too scarred. That's always assuming they do pull out, because there's a bit of a movement growing saying, look, it's been a mistake, we should stay in. I would take that view, but it's probably wishful thinking. Speak to you again next week.